So we'll start with our first plenary session. That's on the migrant crisis in Turkey, Greece, and Germany. Associate Professor Dimitris Tsarouchas from Bilkent University in Turkey, who's also head of Department of International Relations, is going to talk about Turkey and the migrant crisis. Then we have Professor Dimitris Keridis from Pandion University of Athens and director of Navarino Network, speaking on Greece and the migrant crisis. And then we have Dr. Christina Krause, who's coordinator for migration at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Berlin, talking about Germany's EU policy on the migrant crisis. You have 15 minutes each.
Thank you very much to the organizers for giving us the opportunity to speak on such a very important subject. I'll try to be brief, but before I start the presentation, which Pavlos is kindly setting up right now, a couple of provisos. The first, as Alexandra mentioned, I'm the head of Department of International Relations, but my area of academic expertise is not migration policy. So whatever you hear today, please take it with a pinch of salt in terms of its scientific expertise. It's much more coming from a citizen that lives in Turkey for a long time, for 10 years now, who is, I think, quite familiar with the environment and who wants to stress a few points that happen to be part of my own research expertise, part of which relates to EU-Turkey relations. So many of the things that I will say, and thank you very much for allowing me to start our panel's conversation, are going to relate to the relationship between Turkey and the EU as a result of the current crisis, the migration and refugee crisis. And I will also try to provide you with an overview of migration and refugee policy in Turkey, which is a subject that happens to be quite important at this moment. So the slides are there, so you will allow me to sit here. I've been given this pointer. I am technologically literate, so if something goes wrong, please bear with me, but I'll give it a try. So that's me, and this is what we're talking about. I would like to begin with a bit of thank you, with a little bit of a context in terms of trying to familiarize ourselves with the subject. So the first thing one needs to say is that from a Turkish perspective, this crisis is of course not new. The Syrian civil war in particular has been very important, and of course Turkey is one of the three countries in the Middle East, along with Jordan and Lebanon, which has been bearing the burden of trying to accommodate people fleeing the civil war since 2011. What has changed over time is the numbers and the, if you like, the aggressiveness of the process. So the crisis has only become European, within quotation marks, since last summer, with EU member states receiving approximately 1 million Syrian refugees, which has led to the huge debate, some of which were already alluded to by previous speakers. In Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, more than 4 million people are actually being hosted there. And of those, the current numbers seem to suggest that about 2.9 million people are residing in Turkey. The exact figures are eluding us, but approximately 2.9 million have found some form of refuge or accommodation in Turkey. In terms of the population, this is a 1 to 27 ratio. So for every 27 locals, if you like, Turkish people, there is one refugee, primarily from Syria, although there are people fleeing from Iraq as well. And the comparative numbers to Europe are 1 to 588. And I think that gives you the scale and the dimension of the issue in Turkey. Now, the vast majority of Syrian refugees live outside camps. So Turkey created camps early on in 2011, 2012. But those camps have been filled up very quickly. And what has been happening over the last 2 years is that the majority of people that cross the border and come into Syria do not live in organized accommodation any longer. In Istanbul in particular, which has absorbed the highest number for obvious reasons, being the most developed city in the country, very often they have to live somehow under very squalid conditions. The majority of the rest of the refugees, by the way, live close to the border. So there is still an expectation, or at least there has been an expectation, that they will be able to go back home. So they live in cities such as Şanlıurfa, Mardin, and so on. Less people have moved towards central Anatolia. In terms of the relationship between the two sides, given the numbers, you can imagine that we're talking about almost 3 million people coming over, sometimes literally overnight. There are no major incidents of clash and conflict between locals and Syrian refugees, although there have been isolated incidents, and I will come back to this a bit later. Now, the Turkey's welcoming policy towards Syrian refugees, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, not least in the context of the EU deal, was predicated on a foreign policy assumption, and that was the assumption that the Assad regime, following the onslaught of the Arab Spring, would not be around for too long. So the very generous policy that was followed at the beginning of the crisis in terms of welcoming refugees was very much based on the assumption that the Assad regime would collapse within a few months or so. And of course, the fact that the civil war has followed a very different path and that Bashar al-Assad is still in power has meant that this policy logic had to be undermined. Turkey has spent, according to official estimates, about $5 billion on the refugees up until 2015, so this doesn't include any expenditure incurred recently, and it has received support, financial support from the international community that amounts to about 3% of this entire sum. Now, Turkey has met with high rates of economic growth, at least until recently, but still remains very much a developing nation. At this point, the issue of the perceived lack of financial as well as political solidarity on the part of the Western world continues to be one of the points of contention between the Turkish government and the Western community. And so, of course, as I was trying to allude to before, the inflow of Syrian refugees has accelerated to such an extent since 2013 that quite clearly state capacity to deal with those in an organized manner, I think, has by now reached its limits. And some would, I think, would be entitled to say that the state has gone beyond its limits in being able to accommodate this vast numbers of people. And we have some indications on this in terms of public opinion data. So there are now indications that often the issue of Syrian refugees in particular becomes a point of political contention. Very often the argument is being made that Syrian migrant workers receive less than the minimum wage, which is legally enshrined in the Turkish legal system. This is leading to conflict, particularly where large numbers of Syrian refugees are concentrated in urban areas, especially in the southern part of Turkey. And poll after poll nowadays shows that people's ability to continue hosting them in one way or another, formally or informally, is reaching its limits. And so the problem for Turkey, I think, is magnified exactly at the same time as for the EU. It's becoming more and more of an issue, particularly when it comes to this financial aspect and the economic aspect. The idea that is that people that work essentially in menial jobs that receive the minimum wage are now being undercut by a competition which is fueled by the Syrian refugees, and within a context in which the unofficial, the informal, the unregistered economy in Turkey is still a very large chunk of the overall economy. So even if you take aside the migration and refugee problem, the unregistered economy is estimated to be somewhere between 20 to 30% of overall Turkish GDP until now. This is not particularly interesting, I think. This is simply a contextual slide just to let you know of some of the basic tenets of Turkey's migration policy with regard to foreign people. And what you see there is what I think are the landmark sort of legislative initiatives that were taken by Turkey. What is important to keep from this is that traditionally Turkish policy has been based and therefore has been heavily criticized on the idea that those who are entitled to receive the status of being a refugee in the country would have to be, as you see from the 1934 law, of Turkish culture and descent. And this has been a trend that largely has been followed in Turkey until now. I mean, the country has changed in a variety of different ways, but when it comes to migration policy, and especially granting the status of refugees, Turkey has been on the receiving end of criticism in a variety of ways. It's a country that has signed up to the Geneva Convention as well as the additional protocol, but as you can see on the second point, with a so-called geographical limitation. And what's the geographical limitation? A right to asylum is given only to Europeans. Now, this is, given the context in which we live today, I think it's generally acknowledged that this is largely an unsustainable policy and that Turkey cannot possibly continue with that particular policy anymore. So the consequence of this is that migrants are illegal, they're not entitled to stay, even after granted refugee status. Now, what happens more recently, after the end of the Cold War, and as a result of the large number of refugees starting to come to Turkey, so after the end of the Cold War and after the start of the first Gulf War, as well as the Iraq-Iran war of 1980 to 88, Turkey starts receiving people from the Middle East, which is unprecedented, because until that time, many Turkish people would be emigrating to Western Europe in search of a better life. So what happens there is that the other three pieces of legislation that you can see: the asylum regulation after the start of the Iraq war, that offers some temporary protection status to Iraqi refugees fleeing the war and coming into Turkey. And only that offers some basic access to basic services to them. And then the big change that happens in 2013, not least in the context of Turkey's attempt to approximate its legislative system with the European Union and in the process of accession negotiations, is to modernize its law on international protection. So this is the major piece of legislation which finally stops the policy of offering the status of migrant to people of Turkish descent, and there are certain administrative steps being taken, such as the creation of a General Directorate for Migration Management. Then 2 years ago, we had the Temporary Protection Regulation, in which Syrian people in particular, and that again is a point of contention today, this only applies to Syrians, not to other people from other nationalities that may come to Turkey as the result of the deal with Europe. They are offered temporary protection until they can return. They are offered particular identity cards, so biometric cards, so that they can be registered with the authorities. And recently, Turkey also agreed to offer them access to the labor market, which has been celebrated by the European Union as a sign through which people returning from Greece now and moving to Turkey, potentially at least, would be able to be integrated into Turkish society by having the right to access employment, which they have lacked for a very long time. And there's also a shift, by the way, in terms of Turkey's policy away from a more statist approach and towards a more inclusive and, I think, participatory approach that also includes international NGOs and seeks to work with them in order to make this policy successful. However, as you can see at the end, the notion of a permanent settlement for the Syrian refugees, let alone Afghanis or Iraqis, is still not foreseen for Turkey after these changes. And again, that is a very important point of contention. So the slide is there to tell you that the legal framework in Turkey has been improving and has been revised. Fundamentally, however, the idea that people that flee war will be able to stay in Turkey, settle there as part of an integration policy, is actually still missing. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to be a bit more quick, Alexandra. What you can see here is a few things on the EU-Turkey deal. Many of you will know this, I hope. In November last year, a so-called joint action plan was signed between the European Union and Turkey, and that was confirmed in the recent agreement that Mr. Zaharis also mentioned earlier. So there is a one-in, one-out formula, a formula which stops in essence at a particular number, which is 72,000 people. So for any one refugee that will be sent over to Turkey, Turkey will be able to resettle one of the existing refugees to one of the EU member states. And of course the big question there is the extent to which European Union member states will actually agree to that. And another related issue, because they agree on paper and in rhetoric, but we're not quite sure they will agree practically. A second and very important issue is what happens with this number, because 72,000, given the figures I showed you before, is desperately low. And therefore, I think the moment we reach that cap, we are in uncharted territory. The European Union itself now admits that the moment we are at 72,000, what will start is voluntary contributions, and we know what voluntary contributions for many EU member states means. Probably would not work. What Turkey has received in return to, in essence, facilitating European Union policy, in my point of view, what Turkey has received in essence for actually agreeing to do what the EU did not agree to do itself, that is to try and deal with this issue in a coordinated fashion, was to open one accession negotiation chapter, Chapter 33, and much more importantly, and I'd like to emphasize this point, potentially lift the visa requirement for Turkish citizens to travel to the EU. This issue is for Turkey much more important than the accession negotiations. The accession negotiations with the European Union in essence, at the moment, are stalled, and they are technically alive, but I think politically they are not. And therefore, for the Turkish policymakers and for the Turkish public, being able to travel to Europe visa-free in the same way that some Balkan states are now able to do is much more important politically, socially, and economically than actually maintaining the so-called status quo of accession negotiations. One important thing that we should emphasize here, I think, is that Turkey became a key country in this conflict in the year 2015 and is at the moment at the heart of this attempt by the EU to deal with it, not least because of the European Union's inability to deal with the problem in itself. I tried to show to you in the earlier part of my presentation that this situation is now becoming worse for Turkey in terms of the numbers of refugees, but it is not something new. And the country has had to deal with it for a number of years, in contrast to most EU countries. I think the agreement will be very difficult to implement. We already have some indications that this may not work, and some of the reasons are there on my last bullet point. They have to do with logistics, in terms of the trained personnel that will be able to implement the agreement. It will be politically very difficult. Alexandra talked about the terrorist attacks earlier, which create an issue there. Of course, the Cyprus problem is also there in terms of the relations between Turkey and the EU and the inability to move forward on that front. And also legally. As you all know, the European Union has been criticized for this deal in terms of potentially violating international law and the law of protection of refugees. It is now trying to create certain safeguards and make sure that refugees returned to Turkey will be treated according to the standards that the European Union wishes to have. But from the previous slides I showed you, I think it's clear that the Turkish policy on migration and refugee, as well as asylum seekers and granting them rights, is much more restrictive than the EU. And Turkey, knowing that it is in a position of strength in this particular issue, is quite unlikely to force through legislative changes simply to satisfy the European Union. And therefore, it's going to be, I think, quite difficult to see through this particular agreement. An alternative, a revision of it may be in the cards, but this particular agreement will be quite difficult to implement. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
And we move on to Professor Dimitris Keridis on Greece.
Thank you very much. Just before I start, let me just point out to some statistics that came to my mind as I was listening to Kalypso's introductory remarks. According to the latest statistics, 160,000 children were born by Syrian refugees in Turkey alone the last 3 years, 160,000. When in the whole of Greece, around 90,000 babies are born every year. That gives you the size of the problem. 800,000 children reside among those 2.9 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, 1 out of 3 out of 4. 320 of them, 320,000 goes to school, but the rest don't. And it's a big social problem in Turkey how to increase the places for Syrian children, school-age children, to go to school. Now, in Greece, we don't have the statistics yet, and we don't even have begun to think about these medium long-term policies vis-a-vis, but we'll come to that. Now, I am Dimitris, thank you, Keridis. And I'm very happy to be here. This is the second meeting we are having the last month on the topic, together with Susanna. Last time it was her friends, her colleagues from Ankara, the Adenauer Foundation in Ankara, who came here and had a very nice, very interesting Greek-Turkish meeting on the problem. Now we expand within the parameters of this larger project, which I hope will find the necessary funding from EU, so that we will have more meetings to come, not only here in Thessaloniki, which, as Kalypso just mentioned, has proven quite hospitable to the refugees. Thessaloniki has this reputation of being a city of refugees, right? I wonder how they would have been treated all these refugees had they gone to the Peloponnese, but that's a different story. I don't want to go into that. But not only Thessaloniki, the whole plan includes meetings elsewhere along the so-called Balkan corridor. And I would like to welcome all our Balkan corridor guests from Germany down south, all the way, who made the trip and came here to Thessaloniki for this meeting. Now, this is the second time I speak after Professor Tsarouchas, and as I said before, he not only makes us proud that a Greek academician thrives in Turkey, but also envious and jealous of the fact that a Greek is heading an IR department in an elite Turkish university, Bilkent University in Ankara, the oldest private, oldest and biggest and most prestigious private university, non-for-profit private university in Turkey, in Ankara. And he teaches Turkish foreign policy and Turkish international politics, international relations to the Turkish students. I wish our universities had an equally open mind here in Greece, which they don't. We are still battling to introduce English classes in our graduate programs, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to stress that, and to have you. Every time you come, you have very, very interesting things to say. Now, I have not, because I'm totally technologically literate, I have not prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I will restrict my comments to three main points. 3 points. One has to do with the politics of the crisis. The second with the famous, now celebrated deal at hand, the deal of March 18th, which remains to be implemented starting from April 4th, and so on. And thirdly, my third point, where do we go next? Now, the politics. As it was very nicely put already, the whole problem became a European problem the moment the few refugees started arriving into Europe. It was a forgotten problem until the summer of 2015. The fact that 1 out of 4 residents in Lebanon is Syrian refugee did not much worry the Europeans. They have always been refugees. Most refugees, almost 100%, come from the third world. 95, 96, 97% of them go to the third world. There are millions of refugees from Afghanistan in Iran or in Pakistan. Nobody cares, nobody hears about. The moment they cross into the first world, it becomes a problem, obviously. And so they became a problem starting in the summer. And in a certain way, it has acquired a size, an exaggerated size in the European imagination and consciousness beyond what the numbers justify. After all, this is a continent of 560 million people. Okay, 1 million here, 1 million there. I don't want to underestimate the problem, but because there are so many numbers going on, I was listening to a speech the other day by Viktor Orban. I know we have a Hungarian friend who will be talking to us in the next panel about Hungary, and he was talking about the hundreds of millions of immigrants, potentially terrorists, who want to come and change Europe forever from this Christian continent into, Muslim, whatever, melange. So it's important to get the numbers right and to remember that there is a lot of exaggerations, because this is a problem that is prone to political exploitation and exaggeration. There is an ongoing political battle in Europe, starting with the refugee crisis, and maybe continuing on the previous crisis we had with the euro, but taking a new proportions. And the battle has to do with either more or less Europe. Would the solution come from a deepening of European integration, of trying to find solutions at a European level, for example, by establishing a Europe-wide asylum service. One idea that is floating around that has to do with the deal at hand, because we know that national authorities, especially Greek national authorities, will have great difficulty in implementing the deal at hand on their own. So we need a European solution. Or are we going to revert to national solutions, where every country is for itself, building fences and helping others build fences? Because we have Hungarians and other Central Europeans coming to the Balkans and helping the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and maybe Bulgaria and Albania to do the same with the fence. So more or less Europe, this is one. And this Europe is going to be open or closed. Is it going to be a fortress Europe or not? Now, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna kind of, liberal European, open Europe, and I want to emphasize out loud that this open Europe has a lot of problems, by the way, which Orban and others are all too keen to exploit. And let's not underestimate, because there are all sorts of questions related. For example, does a refugee have the right to choose the country within Europe to settle or not? And if he does have the right, that means that most of them will go to Germany, and there will be no burden sharing and no European solidarity involved in facing the crisis. So does everyone have the right to choose where, and not only which country, but even which region of the country? And in Germany there has already been a case about that, when the German government wanted to resettle some of them in Eastern Germany and in other parts of Germany, etc. We have a German colleague, she can talk to us about this. So is this famous Convention for the Protection of Refugees, signed in 1951 under totally different historical conditions, immediately after the Second World War, obsolete? Should it be revised in this new globalized world? Because it gives too much of an open-ended kind of protection to refugees. These are serious questions, and we should not be politically correct and avoid them, because others are exploiting them. So there is a battle in Europe for the soul of Europe. It's not the first time we have such a battle, but it is a fierce battle today. Most of it happens within the center-right, the Christian Democrats. And let me remind you that the two antithetical poles in this battle, Mrs. Merkel on the one side, and Mr. Orban on the other, both belong to the same political party, the Christian Democrats. And because they are the biggest political force in Europe, they are the biggest political force in the European Parliament, they rule over most of European countries, alone or in coalition. The center-left is rapidly becoming irrelevant, one way or another. And so it's mostly, when we talk about the battle, inside the mainstream, it's mostly among the center-right. Now, Greece has contributed to this battle, of course, and it is ironic because this is a government that came to power with the promise of changing Europe, and changing they have, but not in the way they had envisioned, and not because of the battle over the Eurozone. But when this battle on the Euro was being waged, last spring, with some very, fancy figures like Mr. Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister, on the backside, something else was brewing and getting ready to explode. Nobody had noticed Mrs. Christodoulopoulou at the time, and nobody was, very few were paying attention. And in a way, Mr. Tsipras and his government enabled, in a way, not in every way, but in a way, enabled Mr. Orban and the others to take over. And what we are seeing today out of the crisis is a strengthening of the xenophobic, anti-European, right-wing, nationalist, put whatever other adjective you want, forces in Europe. We saw that in Croatia, in election after election, in Poland. Of course, in Hungary, you don't have much further to go. You have reached the limit. And you will see it in the elections. You've seen it even in Germany, where for the first time you have a party to the right of the Christian Democrats entering state parliaments in the 3 state elections with some 50% grosso modo average percentage, high, in one state coming second, this Alternativa, an Alternativa which is a Greek creation, right? We created Alternativa. It came to the fore in 2013 opposing the second Greek bailout, the Greek bailout, and it got strengthened out of the refugee crisis in which we are one way or another involved. So we are destroying the German political system, having destroyed our own first, right? So there is a battle, a big battle. And we, paradoxically and ironically, because history is so ironious, found ourselves suddenly, because Greece and Greek national interest, beyond the shenanigans of petty party politics, is in favor of more Europe overall, and of an integrated Europe. Greek government, a government that came to power denouncing all its opponents as Merkelists, which in Greek sounds very bad, right? I don't know how it sounds in German or if it has any significance in German, but in Greek it sounds very bad. And as German collaborators, all of us, right? A government that came to power under this slogan finds itself in cahoots with Mrs. Merkel, and on the same side. And this is very interesting. And suddenly Mrs. Merkel and the German position is our biggest supporter and friend in this battle, which has implications for not only what kind of Europe we're going to have, but how we're going to resolve the Greek economic crisis and all other things involved. So this is it. Point number 2, as is usually the case in Europe, the solution proposed is a compromise. So it's a compromise solution, and we came up with this famous deal of March 18th, right? You know, it's a complicated, European solutions are always very complicated. I have tried to explain it to my students or to my television audience. Nobody understands, it's fine. Most Greek politicians don't. They're going to be voting about it today. It was introduced to Parliament. Tomorrow they're going to be voted under emergency procedure. This is a government that has no, everything is emergency. So tomorrow is the emergency procedure to vote that deal as Greek law. Most Greek deputies don't understand, have not read it, doesn't matter. Anyway, it's complicated. It's an internal and an external compromise. External compromise is, of course, a compromise with Turkey, give and take, and with its Sultan in Ankara. It has a certain bad smell. And it's not only the Turkophobes on the right, but also the liberals on the left, in places like Sweden, where these things matter, human rights, sensitive people, how to deal with Turkey. There are some carrots for Turkey, like visa, okay, the visa regime, of which Greece is going to benefit a lot. Because don't forget that Greece, although a member of the Schengen, doesn't really benefit from Schengen much, because Schengen free travel between Greece and the rest of Schengen is very little compared to what happens between Austria and Germany on a daily basis, okay? Where we're talking about millions of crossovers, border crossovers a day, or between Poland and Germany, or between Poland and Czech Republic, etc., etc. There, the integration really works. And if Schengen disappears, they will pay the highest price, let's not forget. Greece is a country that shares no Schengen border with any other nation. Schengen in Greece is basically limited to air travel alone, etc., etc. And whereas we don't benefit much, we pay a cost for it because we cannot have visa-free tourist travel from places like Russia, places like Turkey, and now that this visa liberalization might help Greek tourism further. Istanbul is just a few hours away from Salonika. Istanbul is a city of almost 20 million people, 5 of which are fairly wealthy, and they don't have good beaches around. If you go to Marmara Sea, you know. And to reach Smyrna, you take like 10 hours by car. You can come to Halkidiki in less than 6, right? So it makes sense. And we are one of those who want the visa liberalization. The problem, of course, is that out of the 17 million Turkish passport holders, less than 1% has biometric passports, which is a prerequisite for the visa liberalization. It will take years for the Turks to issue the new passports, but this is something nobody mentions, and you're not going to find this information in the news. There is an internal compromise, which has also its bad sides. There are two main flaws, technical and political. Okay, the technical flaws is, do we have the infrastructure to implement? And for this to happen, the deal to be implemented, we need a new asylum service in Greece. We have 250 people in the Greek asylum service, headed by a very competent woman, which is very bizarre for a Greek public service, but she was chosen meritocratically years ago, and for some reason she has not yet been fired. Let's hope that she stays there. We had her in our previous meeting. 250, the Greek asylum service needs to build up to more than 3,000, almost 4,000 people in order to be able to process the thousands of applications that will come about on the first degree and on the second degree. And on the second degree, this government has avoided to introduce a second degree appeal procedure because until now it wanted the process to drag on forever so nobody is returned, because we don't believe that, this activist government. It's funny how things change and how life takes its revenge. The same technical problems apply to Turkey as well, that needs to also build. You see, you have a country, first of all, who has not signed the 1951 Refugee Protection Convention, with the exception of Europeans, meaning communists. I mean, it was basically for East Europeans escaping communism during the Cold War, the protection that Turkey was offering. We know that there are not that many European refugees, leaving Europe to go to Turkey for protection these days. And I don't expect, God forbid, many. So here we have a country we have to work with, which has refused to sign the basic treaty, a country that we have to declare as a safe country when bombs explode like, I don't know, in Istanbul, in Ankara, let alone what is happening in the southeast, where there is almost a quasi-civil war in certain Kurdish areas, that as far as pictures are concerned, are not that much different from pictures from Syria, if you see some of these Turkish villages down there. But anyway, we have all these problems. Let's hope that we deal with them and that the Greek administration, which has excelled, quote unquote, the last year, will manage the thing that starts April 4th. So everybody who has come to Greece after March 20th has to be detained in the Greek islands, has to be processed in there, and then after the two, I have to conclude, yeah. They then return after the 2 degrees, first and second, the appeal. Finally, my third point, what happens if the deal doesn't work, which is the most probable? Let me remind you that the previous deal, the September deal, the famous relocation deal that provided for the relocation of 160,000 refugees from Greece, Italy, and Hungary directly to the rest of Europe, ended up relocating only 962 out of the 160,000, right? So you see, this is less than 1%, much less than 1% of the original plan. And this is a deal now that is very ambitious. It puts a lot on Greece's shoulder. It dictates to the other Europeans to bring a technical support to Greece. None has come yet, except for some Frontex people. We'll see. So what if not? Point number 3, and I conclude very quickly. Greece needs to start thinking about the medium-long term, not only the immediate humanitarian crisis at hand, policies of how to integrate these people, how to provide for their education, how to provide for social inclusion and labor opportunities as well. Many of them are capable, competent people. This is a discussion that is totally absent from the Greek public space. But somehow it has to come about. We have a certain successful example of what happened in this country in the 1990s, when around 1 million people, almost, mainly from Albania, but not only, from ex-Soviet Union, republics, etc., got integrated quite nicely into the Greek social fabric. So we have a certain experience. This is not the same, certainly, but we can draw some lessons from our successful past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. It pains me to interrupt you, but we have to listen to Dr. Christina Krause as well from Konrad Adenauer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure being here today. Okay, let's move on from Turkey to Greece to Germany, where we have witnessed very chaotic situations also in the past year, situations that many people around Europe probably would have thought impossible in the country where everything is organized, but even we don't manage to build an airport or certain train stations. So believe us, not everything is organized and perfect. Which leads us to the topic of migration and refugee situation currently. I want to start by going back in time to explain a bit of what forms our refugee migration soul and culture, because we really have to return to the beginnings of the Federal Republic of Germany to understand our motivations, to understand the system that is in place, to understand the discussions currently, and also Merkel's position, who, by the way, we don't talk about Merkeliana, but we call her Mutti, mom. So we're her kids, we're her followers, not Merkeliana. You do too. Oh boy. Mutti. So even before the 1951 Geneva Convention was developed, we had our basic law developed in 1949. Adenauer was one of the chairs of this process, so we're very proud to be named after him. In the 1949 Basic Law, or Grundgesetz, we have Article 16 saying that everyone who's politically persecuted shall be granted asylum. So this is our Bible, and Article 16 is very much the core. Why was this article necessary, apart from Article number 1 saying that die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar, the worth of the human shall never be touched. So every human being, you know, is created, inspired equally, but also from God as his copy, as his model. So the worth of human shall never be touched, which of course comes back from our dark past in the Second World War of Nazi regime. So apart from Article 1, the worth of the individual that should never be touched, Article 16 played a very, very important role, and even before the 1951 Convention. So we feel very much obliged to protect people because the Jews were not protected. You probably all know that this end solution only was put in place because people were not offered a safe haven anywhere around the world. You probably also know that people who had to flee Germany could not land in the US Many did not find safe havens. So we are very much today obliged through our past to give people a safe haven, to not leave them wandering, going from A to B to Z, finding a safe haven, a protection for themselves, for their families. So this is very much, really, it lies at the core of our understanding of our being a nation, of protecting individuals, protecting people. So Article 16 is very fundamental. Apart from the asylum article, of course, we also introduced the Geneva Convention, but for a very long time, they had a parallel existence, and only in the 90s it changed that the Geneva Convention kind of got a superior position over the asylum article. But apart from people who we are trying to protect, we also have migration groups that have ethnical German backgrounds, also because of our past in the Second World War and because Germans living in the Soviet Union or other places were persecuted. So after the end of the Cold War and even during the times of Cold War, we admitted many ethnic Germans who had emigrated in the 17th, 18th century and further on. So we always had, apart from refugees, contingencies of ethnic Germans. And also, because of the responsibility to our past, to Jews. We also, especially after the Second World War, wanted to become a safe haven and also a future home for Jews around the world. And around 20,000 came after the end of the World War from the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union countries. And today we're very proud that Jewish life is developing again in Germany. So we had the categories, refugees, who got the German basic law asylum, who got the Geneva Convention asylum, then the ethnical Germans, and then the Jews. But apart from them, starting in the 1950s, of course, we had labor migrants. And being here in Thessaloniki, I mean, many, I believe, probably you have relatives who came to Germany in the 50s and who had this experience of being a labor migrant. But for a long time, we thought those are temporary migrants. They're going to leave pretty soon. But no, they stayed. And Max Frisch, a famous German literate author, said, we called for laborers, but we got humans. So again, we have the sentiment of dealing with people. It's different. You know, we're dealing with people, and their fate is being formed, and their fate is being changed through migration. So in the 50s and 60s, we had big groups of labor migrants. And it was difficult for the young German Federal Republic to deal with this, because we thought we're an ethnically homogeneous country. Although after the Second World War, things were in turmoil. We had 14 million Germans coming from the Eastern Territory, so the society was in movement, and then we had labor migrants. I mean, everything in the 50s was still in movement. But then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and until the 80s, Germany said, we're not an immigration country. We're a clear, ethnically, pretty much undivided nation. But even then, that wasn't true. But only until the 2000 years, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, we had many commissions. The vice mayor talked about commissions that have to deal with problems, who tried to analyze, what is Germany? What are we? Are we an immigration country? Or we tried to find a formula saying we're not like the US or Canada, Australia. We said we're Zuwanderungsland, not Einwanderungsland. You know, so people come to us, but not necessarily to stay for a long time. So apart from these different categories, that it's a very complex system, the issue of definition is always a very hot one in Germany. Okay, so let's jump now. I've told you about 49, 51, about the 50s, 60s, 70s. Let's jump into what happened after the end of the World War, and also the conflicts which you witnessed here in this region, the wars in the Western Balkans. In those times, we had around 450,000 civil war refugees who came from former Yugoslavia. And that brought our net migration to a big scope. And in those years, we reformulated our asylum policies, introducing the concept of safe countries of origin, and also in those years, the Dublin system was developed. People who came from the Civil War region, that is very close by, did not get the Geneva Convention protection, but subsidiary protection. Often they got only a toleration permit, a Duldung, which was very difficult, but it kind of reminded me of what's happening in Turkey, is to see, well, let's see every few months how things are developing, and then, but leaving these people, I mean almost 500,000, in quite a limbo. So I think we've learned from that experience that it's not good to leave people in such a volatile situation, although what helped us a lot in those years, I believe, is our federal system. People who back then were distributed to go to Bavaria or Baden-Württemberg, to the rich states, they were integrated very quickly also into the labor markets. They got to get educations, higher educations, and because there was a great need, they really integrated quickly, and later on, when they became part of society, they stayed. But those who went to Eastern Germany, that's economically weak, or also to Berlin, other places, they were kept in a very difficult situation, often having to wait a few months, not being able to leave the area where they're located, not being able to find a working place elsewhere. But still, this federal system helped us, to see where was the need, where could people be integrated, and where couldn't they. But many were returned after the conflict situation ended. And in Germany today, this time of accepting civil war refugees is seen as a very positive example, nevertheless. So going from the 90s, where we have these new categories of civil war refugee, we also had the kind of new categories of EU citizens who now had the freedom of movement. We had many students coming in, and then in the years starting from 2000, we have high-skilled labor migrants that are attracted and that get certain working permits. So again, new categories. And now, but I have to mention one more thing. In this time, about 15 years ago, we were discussing very lively, again, the idea, are we an immigration country or a migration country, or what are we? And I remember one speech by a great professor who started saying, well, look at our national soccer team. They're not so bad, but look at them. Where do they come from originally? So we're a very multinational country. And today we have realized that. So we have made this little publication last year, Zielland Deutschland, it's called, a country that's a goal for migration. And it states, for example, that every fifth German has a migrant background. Every fifth person in Germany today. And now to the European refugee crisis that touched us in last summer, I can say that every seventh German is involved in voluntary work. So there is also a very great support for people who come. Apart from, yes, our political system is being changed, but not so much, I think, for Tsipras and Syriza. But because the topics are different, and I think every political system has to live, and if new topics come up, and the politics, they need time to find the solutions, but often these solutions, that's what our Chancellor has been saying, we need time to solve this complex situation. I mean, the conflict isn't just outside our front door, it is also in Europe. I mean, look at the Ukraine and look at the potential of refugees who might come to Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and also to Germany, France, and so on. So there's a great potential also on the Eastern European side, and not just in the Near East and North African corridor. So what our Chancellor has been saying these past months is, we can make it, you know, wir schaffen das, which many people criticize because they say, but what can we? But I mean, to deal with the situation, but we need time. I mean, this is really, we haven't had so many people on the move inside Europe and on just our front step since the Second World War. We have a very sophisticated system of international refugee protection, of labor migration. We have the fundamental freedoms of the EU. But do we have the right instruments to deal with these mass influx situations? I would also question that, and I would also say I think we need to look for that. But then, are all of these questions only to be solved on EU level? I don't think so, because migration and citizenship and integration touch the very soul of every nation. And, you know, not every nation is where another nation has arrived. Every nation needs time to also discuss what do we need, what are we, what's our identity. And I think every country should have this time. And the EU cannot enforce a distribution. I mean, unless a country like Germany now, because of our very singular past, says, we cannot leave these people out in the cold. We cannot leave them to die. We cannot leave them at the mercy of dictators and brutal regimes, because we have seen what can happen. So Germany says we cannot do that, and it's the big majority who says that. Even if AfD, the alternative, got 10, 15%, the overall German population says we can do this, we have to do this. And, but we cannot dictate other countries. You have to do it as well. And I think that's not going to happen from the EU either, because we're a consensus group. I think what we will then turn to is to see where are the strengths of the different countries, who can contribute with what to solve the situation. And I think we're moving ahead very quickly, looking at what's happening in Syria, what is going to happen also in Libya, what's happening in Ukraine, how the sanctions with Russia are. Yes, they're definitely painful for Greece and other countries, but I think they're also working. So let's be optimistic. I'm coming to an end, sorry, but I also want to just remind you of some numbers that, for example, Germany in the last year, we had 2.3 million net migration, and 500,000 were people who filed for asylum. And this is something we always want to draw our attention to say we're sharing the burden. We're not leaving Italy alone, or Greece alone, or Hungary, who in fact have accepted, Germany has accepted about 1/3 of the EU asylum seekers last year. Hungary has accepted 14%. So this is something people shouldn't forget either. Sweden 12, Italy and Austria each 7, France 6%. So we're ready to be solidary with the other countries. We're ready to find fair solutions, but we have to do this together, and that's where I want to end. Thank you very much.